Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today, and hope everybody's day is off to a good start. We're back today for our second training session, our TCFD 102. Last Tuesday, we were discussing in TCFD 101 what is TCFD and how to get started on TCFD. And today we're going to take more of a deep dive, and we're going to look at building experience in climate-related financial disclosures. So just before we get started, just a reminder of your facilitators today. Myself, I'm Tiffany Grabsky, the Academy Head at the UNSSC Initiative, and I'm joined today by Evan Guy, Senior Policy Manager at CDP. Same as on Tuesday, we're both here with you today to help you through all of this content and to answer any of your questions. So please don't hesitate to ask us questions at any point. Now, just a quick review of the agenda today. So the first 15 minutes, we're just going to do a quick overview and introduction. We'll actually probably shorten this a little bit because we don't have any opening comments today. And then we're going to dive straight into the content. So last time, if you remember, those of you who were with us, we went through 4 core pillars of the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So we're going to go through each of those 4 core pillars today, and we're going to provide examples of what that looks like in practice. Then after that, we'll take a short 5-minute break. And then in the second half of today's session, we're going to go back to those implementation steps, and we're going to discuss some of the key challenges that many companies face when they start implementing or aligning their disclosures with the TCFD. And we'll do another exercise together where you can test your knowledge, looking at a few different example disclosures and identifying what's the good, the bad, the ugly. How do we move forward to continually improve? And as with last time, we will provide you with additional resources at the end on how you can continue your learning journey. And also, we're going to save some time at the end for Q&A. So just a few housekeeping issues. Those of you who weren't with us last time, this is just an invitation for you to introduce yourself in the chat box. And those who were with us, please don't hesitate to remind us who you are. We'd like to know maybe what country you're in, what industry you work in, what role you play in your organization. This helps us tailor our training to your needs. Also, as mentioned, we will have time for Q&A at the end, I hope. But just in case we don't, sometimes we get talking too much about the questions that pop up in the Q&A chat box. Please ask your questions when they come to mind. So make use of that Q&A box. You'll have both a chat function and a Q&A function. If you use that Q&A function to ask us questions, we can make sure that we answer every one of those. Also, the first question we often get is, will this material be available? So indeed it is. At the end of the presentation, we will send the slides to everybody, both in the chat box on Zoom, and you'll also get them in the post-Zoom email, which arrives about 1 day after the session. So here, just a reminder, this is what you're looking at the bottom of your screen, hopefully. Just the key thing there is that Q&A box. You can see 2 kind of speech bubbles. That's where we'd like you to ask your questions. You can use the chat box for any kind of logistical issues, or if you're wanting to share with the rest of the participants any comments. Also, when we do the activity, the exercise at the end, you can use the chat box to share your findings as you're reviewing the exercise. If you do have any questions at the end, we'll ask you to raise your hand. So maybe just locate where that raise hand is. And currently we have everybody on mute. But if you do want to ask a question at the end and you raise your hand, we can indeed unmute you. Okay, so this is a training program that's really 3-pronged. So last Tuesday, we did the TCFD 101 together. I hope many of you were there with us. And that really was meant to set the foundation to understand where TCFD comes from and where we're moving from there. So today in TCFD 102, that middle box, we're really looking at building experience in climate-related financial reporting. And once we conclude today, and hopefully you've achieved the main objectives of this session, we will send you off to continue learning with the TCFD 102E, which is a self-guided learning platform, which Evan's going to talk to you more about later today. So today's objectives, we have 3 key objectives we'd like to achieve today. So the first one is we're looking to help you build a more detailed understanding of the TCFD's recommended disclosures and how to achieve this in practical means. The second key objective is to help you to understand what good practice looks like through a series of case studies or examples of real life reports. And finally, we're here to help you identify those internal processes that are necessary to support climate risk and opportunity reporting, and how to overcome those pesky challenges that get in the way as you're moving forward. So as I mentioned, before we get started, we wanted to flag one resource that we use, but as I had mentioned, we use a lot of resources to help you through this training. So please don't hesitate to read these after our session ends. This here is the model guidance on climate disclosure. We're going to be looking specifically at chapters 3 and 4 today. So if you'd like to do additional reading when we finish this training, we highly recommend checking out those chapters. In the 101 session, we were covering chapters 1 and 2. So we're going to continue on with that guidance in the model guidance on climate disclosure. Now you can find that through the link in the chat box. You can also find it on the SSE's publication page. And of course, you can find all the resources that we're discussing today in the TCFD Knowledge Hub, which is a really great depository of all the resources that you could need as you continue your TCFD learning journey. So with that, and now that you know what we're doing here today, we would like to know a little bit more about you. So we discussed these 4 core pillars last time. Now we would like to know which ones you find the most challenging so that we can keep that in mind as we're doing our training today. So do you find the most challenging pillar to be governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets? So you can select, unfortunately, just one of those today, but we'd like to know the one that is the most challenging for you. And while you fill that in, I'm going to pass over to Evan, who's going to take us through the first session. Thanks, Evan. Over to you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Tiffany. And thank you all for joining us again today. Hopefully that means our first session was valuable, and hopefully we can really look to build on everything that we covered in that first session and really particularly get through some case studies and examples today. I'll just give everyone another moment to fill out the poll. But it's looking like a relatively pretty even split across these 4 different pillars. Indeed, there are a number of you that struggle with governance, a number of you that struggle with strategy, I think the most with risk management as well as metrics and targets. This is really great for us to know. We're going to go through some examples of each of these and hopefully sort of address or dispel some of those challenges that you might be having. So please, as we get to the end of covering one of these pillars, if we haven't clarified that challenge, please ask us questions, and hopefully we can get everyone at a more confident understanding of what they need to do around each of these pillars. But let's get right into the deep dive of the TCFD recommended disclosures. Before we get into the case studies themselves, I just wanted to review this slide, which is really, really important. We saw this in the last session and Tiffany went over it, but to remind you, this is the sort of holistic look at the TCFD, and it's particularly to remind you that all of these 4 pillars of the TCFD are interlinked. They work together and really should be tackled as holistically as possible, because good governance of climate-related issues really set the framework for your organization strategy that flows from this framework. The strategy is based on appropriate risk management, and it is all underpinned by effective metrics and targets. And so while we'll go through each of these pillars one by one, it's important to really emphasize that they should not be tackled in silos. And we went over a suggested phased approach where you can start with different areas of the TCFD and really look to build them out together. And we'll give you another example of what that might look like later on. And with that, we have our first example for today, which comes from the company Lendlease. We see Lendlease here really deciding to approach its disclosure in this sort of phased but continued way, showing that activities and reporting under the different pillars can be carried out in conjunction with one another. And Lendlease has taken this approach where they have started particularly with certain governance and certain strategy disclosures, and then later moved on to expand on that around building on metrics and targets, as well as risk management. But you'll see sort of communicated in the report that the company doesn't stop with the initial sort of governance work that they do and strategy work that they do at the beginning. They sort of look to build this out and make this more comprehensive over time, so that all of the areas are really built of the TCFD are being built out together and really strengthening each other. For each of the TCFD core elements, Lendlease reports transparently on the progress that they've made in the reporting year, including sort of the actions that they've taken to progress their disclosure in that year and the actions that they have planned for the future. So now that we have really sort of highlighted the importance of alignment and this interconnectedness, let's get into that first core pillar of the TCFD, which is governance. And so governance is about disclosing an organization's governance around climate-related risks and opportunities. And so there's a couple of really key things that investors want to understand. So particular investors want to know and get a better understanding of the context of the company in terms of how it's approaching and embedding financial risk into its operation, in terms of the structure and overall approach to climate change. And in particular, investors want to be able to understand and see that a proper level of attention is being dedicated by the board and management of an organization to factor climate into their operations and decision-making. This gets us to the first of two recommended disclosures under the governance pillar. So the first is to disclose the role of the board of the organization in overseeing climate-related issues. So here, there's a couple of key things to consider reporting on. So for example, first starting with the processes and frequency by which the board considers climate change. So does your company have particular board committees that focus on the topic or might consider it? How often is this item on their agenda? And what role in addressing the issue does the committee play in particular? Additionally, with the board, you'll also want to disclose information on whether the board considers climate-related issues when reviewing strategy, risk management policies, expenditures, and other key decisions. How are these climate-related risks and opportunities that you're identifying factored into these decisions? And then how does board monitor and oversee progress against targets for addressing climate-related issues? What role exactly does the board play in this? That allows us to sort of, hopefully that's clear what that looks like at the sort of board level. The second recommended disclosure then moves from the board level to management. And so the second recommended disclosure is to report on the role of management in assessing and managing climate-related issues. And so it's important to emphasize here that the TCFD refers to management quite broadly as any level of senior governance below the board level. So it's important to keep that in mind. But here, a number of key things come into play. So first, you should consider a discussion on what specific individual roles and committees and functions there are that have oversight over climate change at the management level. You don't necessarily need to give the person's specific name, but what role, what position do they occupy within the organization? What exactly do these individuals do? How do they fit within the overall organizational structure? How might they be kept informed of climate-related issues that have to do with their job? How do they monitor climate-related issues and the performance metrics that they might be considering? And then last but certainly not least, how are management and the board connected? How are these first two recommended disclosures connected? How does the management inform board decisions? And how are board decisions then communicated to the management? And you may remember from our last session that one of the real benefits that comes from going through this process of TCFD disclosure is to build a stronger connection between management and your board on climate. And this is where you can really demonstrate that this is working. Let's bring this and hopefully make this a bit clearer through an example. Here we have an example from the company Legal and General. Here, quite usefully, when it comes to this governance pillar, there's a sort of governance structure outlined visually, including the committees, and particularly with Legal and General, the Group Environmental Committee that has oversight over climate, and it sort of outlines here the role that the committee plays, particularly around setting metrics and targets, assessing risk, and having general oversight over the strategy. We see this sort of outlined here. And further sort of roles and responsibilities of this committee are outlined in that narrative description that you see there. So this is a good example of some of the types of information and how this information can be presented in your report. Hopefully that's clear with the governance pillar. And with that, we can have a look at the second pillar of the strategy, that second layer of the onion diagram, which is strategy. And strategy really focuses on reporting on the actual or potential impacts of climate-related risks and opportunities on your company's businesses, strategy, and financial planning, where that information is material and how this is being strategically addressed. What matters here, particularly to investors, is an understanding of a company's future business model, how it is aligning or responding to these risks and opportunities that it has been identified. And then the second piece being around the risks and opportunities that are identified through scenario analysis and the processes used to incorporate them into a company's strategy and financial plans. And I'll get into scenario analysis in a bit more detail in a second, because this is what area of the TCFD that many organizations struggle with. The first recommended disclosure under the strategy pillar is to describe the climate-related risks and opportunities that the organization has identified over the short, medium, and long term. And so what are those particular physical risks? What are those particular transition risks that your organization is identifying? And then what is the time frame in which those risks might materialize? And you'll remember from last session that we really stressed the importance of attaching time values to these time horizons. So what do you mean when you mean short, medium, long term for your organization? These will vary depending on your organization situation, but it's important that you are defining what you mean and which risks and opportunities are material over those each different time frames. And then it's also important here to sort of report and explain the processes that you have to use to determine whether they will have a financial impact on your organization. The second recommended disclosure under the TCFD then looks, once you've identified what those risks, what those opportunities are, the next step then is to really describe the impact of those risks and opportunities on your company's businesses, strategy, and financial planning. And so some of the critical areas to consider disclosing on here are: how might the impacts from climate change affect your products and services? What are the expected impacts on your value chain? How might this play out in terms of different climate adaptation, different climate mitigation activities, or both? How is this informing your overall investment that you're making into any sort of R&D, any sort of research and development? And then finally, how might you see these risks having a financial impact on your operations? So particularly clarifying the types of operations that you have, the location of facilities that may be impacted by climate change. If you're a large company that has operations in many different countries, the risk exposures and the impacts are likely going to vary quite significantly. And even within countries, depending on where those facilities are, for example, the exposures and the potential impacts and therefore the financial implications are going to be quite different. So it's really important to think through this and understand this and how it informs your strategy. Let's have a look at a couple of examples here to hopefully make this a bit clearer. Here we have an example from CIMB. Here we see nicely in a table all of the sort of key risk types outlined in line with the TCFD risk types. So we see a sort of list of those key transition risks, the sort of policy and legal risk, the technology risk, market risk, reputational risk. We also see physical risk here, being particularly those two main categories of both acute and chronic risk. They then give examples for each of these transition and physical risks, and then really importantly, give examples of the potential transmission channels in which they could have a financial impact on their company. And then on a different page, these financial risks that they have identified are connected to a specific time horizon. And given that time horizon, whether they might materialize over the short term, medium term, or long term. Another case study that we can have a look at to hopefully make this a bit clearer comes from Deloitte here. We see in their TCFD report, we see them specifically providing a lot of detail here on the acute and chronic physical risks that they're considering. Again, sort of seeing a description of those risks, outline of the potential financial implications. And crucially, I think they've even gotten to the point which a lot of companies haven't quite gotten to, of actually putting a quantitative number behind the financial impact of those acute and chronic risks. And again, attaching what that financial impact is to the certain time horizons that you're considering. So this is another really good example if you're looking for case studies to sort of build off of and emulate and understand how you might go about your own reporting. And with that, hopefully the first two recommended disclosures under the strategy pillars a bit clearer, and we can dive into this third, often trickier one. So the third recommended disclosure under the strategy pillar of the TCFD is really about reporting on the resilience of your organization's strategy, taking into consideration these different climate scenarios that we briefly discussed last week, and particularly including a 2 degrees Celsius or lower scenario. This is often referred to as the scenario analysis recommended disclosure. And here it's important to consider reporting on how is your business using climate-related scenarios to inform your business strategy and financial planning. How do you consider these scenarios will play out over the different timeframes that you've already identified? And then what are the implications for your business in terms of the different policies, trends, and energy pathways that may impact the way in which these scenarios play out? But let's dive into a bit more detail on this topic. So scenario analysis is really just a method for developing strategic plans that are more flexible and more robust to a range of possible future states. And so what's important here is it's about looking at alternatives and really trying to look and think beyond business as usual for strategic planning. A scenario will be a pathway that a business sees as plausible, but it does not necessarily have to be a pathway that it expects to see or sees as desirable. It's about looking at several different potential alternatives. And this makes scenario analysis a really valuable tool to think critically about climate change and think about how these different scenarios may impact your company. And what's important to emphasize here is that there's no exact right or wrong when it comes to scenario analysis. It is certainly not about predicting future performance or coming up with an exact prediction of a future state, but the goal is really here to be flexible and adaptable to those risks and opportunities you're identifying. And so it's the credibility of the results of the analysis are not the most important thing here, but in fact, actually the responses to these expected futures that you're considering. This still might seem a bit abstract and a bit intimidating, and you might be asking, Evan, are you asking us to be climate scientists to be able to do this? No, that is not the case. That is not the idea. Hopefully I can dispel this for you. And this is really not the idea behind the TCFD. And so in going through this process, we can use a series of science-based scenarios that have already been designed and that we're here to sort of give you more information on. So through these different scenarios, you will see that there are many different ways that climate change can play out over the next century. Most of them will depend on how we react and what actions we start taking now. So for example, a very ambitious scenario that the world is trying to achieve is limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees as sort of stipulated in the Paris Agreement. In fact, this is still a possible scenario, but in fact, the IPCC just released a sort of additional recent report, which shows that the likelihood, tragically, of reaching that point is becoming less and less likely as we delay action. But this is still a possible and sort of ambitious scenario that the world is sort of looking to try to achieve, and would require really drastic emissions reductions over the short term and continued action over the coming decades. Whereas on current policies, or something more on track between 2.5 to 3 degrees of warming. And so scenario analysis, it becomes a really useful tool to think about these different pathways and the implications that they have for your organization. So they may have implications in terms of what your company's emissions targets may be under these different scenarios. It might also have implications for the energy mix that you might be expecting under a 1.5 versus a current policy scenario. Under both, we're much likely and already starting to see a lot more renewable energy in the mix. And so you'll need to sort of think through this and how it might impact you. We can also expect significant shifts in consumer behavior, and we're already seeing a lot of that. All of these sorts of considerations should be considered and looked at across these scenarios. And to really help you in going about this practice of scenario analysis, our suggestion is really to look through the model guidance resources that we have shared. In this guidance, there's the list of potential scenarios that you can use and the sources where you can get more information on these scenarios. Particularly, have a look at page 18. For example, you have the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Changes, the IPCC, the International Energy Agency, the IEA, and the Network for Greening the Financial System, the NGFS, that all provide science-based scenarios that you can use to help evaluate your organization's resilience to these potential different future states. Okay, once you sort of understand what scenario analysis is and sort of understand what these sort of science-based trajectories might look like, how should you actually go about trying to complete this task of scenario analysis? Well, the first thing to say is, because it is a challenging task, scenario analysis should very much be an iterative process that you really look to improve and build on over time. it can take a number of years from initial disclosure with very limited detail to full analysis backed by data sets. And for this reason, organizations may choose to start with more qualitative scenario narratives or storylines to help explore the range of potential climate change implications. And over time, you can start putting together the qualitative information that you have with more quantitative information to illustrate potential pathways and outcomes. And in time, these scenarios can be really developed and further refined and made more robust by applying further data. Eventually, you can get to having a sophisticated set of scenarios to use to build your organization's resilience backed by both qualitative and quantitative information. To make this a bit more sort of concrete, we have a couple of case studies for you. First, we have a case study from Allianz, who has created a heat map showing the various time horizons that they're considering. So we have a range. We have sort of 2020, 2025, 2030, 2035, 2040. So a range of different timelines here. They look at both two different scenarios, so a 1.5 degree scenario and a 2 degree scenario of warming. They connect this to the asset types that they hold, the risk levels that they're seeing, and factors that may either enhance or mitigate their exposures in order to improve resilience. And this heat map is not necessarily an incredibly detailed exercise, but it really demonstrates in quite a powerful and impactful way that the company is assessing its situation against these commonly used scenarios to help build their organization's climate resilience. Another example that we have on scenario analysis comes from the South African company, Sasol. Here we see Sasol provide a description of scenario analysis conducted for 3 different pathways. We have a 1.5 degree pathway, a 2 degree pathway, and a current pathway. And they give a bit of detail on the assumptions that come with each. Quite crucially, and what I'd like to draw your attention to with this one is that they demonstrate how this testing has shaped their strategy and provide an overview of the areas that they will continue to monitor to ensure that their business strategy will continue to be resilient to these climate risks going into the future. Perfect. We've already covered a fair bit of content already today, so I might just check in, and there should be a poll coming up. The question is, which of the following are true of scenario analysis? Please select all that apply. So it can be both qualitative and quantitative. It supports the development of flexible and robust strategies. The aim is to predict future business performance. Multiple scenarios should be considered, and it is the same as science-based targets. I will give everyone a moment to fill that out. In the meantime, Tiffany, do we have any questions worth raising for the whole group?
Hey, Evan, we did actually just get a question in the chat, which I think is quite interesting. Someone was asking if there's AI to support scenario analysis. I guess we use AI for a lot more now. I'm going to give you the floor for that, but my perspective on that is that I would maybe caution on trying to outsource too much a scenario analysis. It's a really useful tool, but it depends on obviously a company's own situation. So I'm not an AI expert, but I would assume that you'd need to teach the AI a lot about your own company first, because it might rather adapt the scenario analysis to other companies like you or to assumptions that wouldn't be true on your own company. What are your thoughts on AI and scenario analysis?
No, that's a great question, and one maybe slightly starting to step out of my comfort zone. But I think I fully agree with what you said, Tiffany. And I think one of those things where who knows? I mean, AI is so rapidly evolving that our answers could change in a short period of time. But I think for right now, agree with what Tiffany says, and I think the core thing to sort of remember is this is really looking at building resilience, and so you can't just have sort of AI sort of going ahead and doing that piece for you. This really needs to sort of be actively sort of engaged with by you, your team, those involved, and really thinking about how this is going to inform your strategy. And so I think just thinking about reminding yourself of the objective. If you're able to do that with AI, great. I think there could be some value added, but I think the key thing is we're really looking to build resilience. And from what we see right now, yeah, you very much have to be sort of involved, and this has to be tailored to your organization's context. Perfect. I will carry on then. It looks like most of you have answered this poll, which is great. I see that I have indeed largely been clear. That's great. We have 3 correct answers here. So if you selected, it can be both qualitative and quantitative, absolutely. It supports the development of flexible and robust strategies. Sure, absolutely. That is definitely the goal here. And then multiple scenarios should be considered. Absolutely. The more scenarios you look at, the better you can understand your resilience. Now, a few of you did select that the aim is to predict future business performance. That's not exactly the goal that we're trying to get at with scenario analysis. Instead of coming up with a prediction of a future state or business performance, it's about really looking beyond business as usual and looking at many different potential alternatives. A few of you did select same as science-based targets. This is also slightly different. Science-based targets are a very useful tool. CDP is sort of a founding partner of the Science-Based Target Initiative, and I think it's a very useful tool that can help companies in charting their sort of pathway to emissions reductions in line with global climate targets through mitigation and reducing your impacts. But this isn't exactly the focus of scenario analysis. It's not really about looking to set targets and reduce your emissions. It's more about looking into the future and understanding how those different risks and opportunities that you've identified, how they might play out, how they might impact you, depending on the different scenario that we go down, given that there's so much uncertainty around the pathway. Hopefully that's clear. If not, please pop any questions in the chat, and we will carry on to the 3rd pillar, which is this risk management pillar. And this is about understanding and reporting on an organization's approach to identifying, assessing, and managing climate risks. And so investors here really want to understand the processes used to identify climate-related risks and opportunities, as well as how this is influencing business strategy and financial planning. Investors would also like to be able to properly evaluate the impacts of climate change on a company's business model by understanding how it identifies and manages climate-related risks, as well as takes advantage of any opportunities that's also being identified. So we have a few recommended disclosures under this pillar. The first is around the processes that an organization has to identify and assess climate-related risks. So here it's important to report on how do you determine the relative significance of climate-related risks versus other risks that your organization routinely considers, manages, mitigates, etc. Do you consider existing or emerging regulatory requirements related to climate change? We're seeing a lot more action on this front, not only in the disclosure space, but also everything from carbon taxes to additional sort of transition planning requirements. So are you considering these requirements? Do you have any sort of existing risk classification frameworks that inform your climate thinking? It's important to sort of disclose and provide information on that as well. The second recommended disclosure under this risk management pillar is about describing an organization's processes for managing climate-related risks. So particularly critical here is what decisions have you made about those risks that you identified in that strategy pillar? Will your organization be mitigating them? Will they be transferring them? Will they be accepting or controlling them? how do you prioritize these climate-related risks that you're identifying? How are these materiality determinations that are so central to this made within your organizations? These are all really critical things to understand and then report on through your annual report. That brings us to the last recommended disclosure under this risk management pillar. And this is about understanding how you integrate this understanding of climate risks into your organization's overall approach to risk management. The TCFD really aims to ensure that this integration is in place. And if there are aspects of climate risks that are being taken into consideration by your organization, it's important that these are really woven into your company's overall risk management process and not being dealt with separately or on their own. And here, particularly important information to disclose to investors are clarifying whether climate risks are considered a business risk to your organization, and if it is a material issue to your organization, where should it be reported? Should it be reported separately, or if it is financially material, with your mainstream annual report? These are all important considerations to report on and disclose. A case study that might help make this a bit clearer comes from the company Cemex. Here we see in their integrated report how they are integrating their sort of approach to managing climate-related risks into their overall risk management approach. In addition to sort of looking purely at these sort of risk management disclosures, this really sort of shows how these different pillars of the TCFD are connected, because it particularly outlines the management's role in identifying, monitoring, and mitigating those risks. Again, connecting that first governance pillar with this current third risk management pillar. And all of these are really placed within Cemex's overall risk management process. And they're really demonstrating here through their reporting that climate risk isn't, that they're not treating it separately and not reporting it separately, because after all, it is a business risk that the organization faces. And that brings us to the last core pillar of TCFD disclosure, which is the metrics and targets pillar. So this is the pillar that seemed like most of you had challenges with. So please, as we go along, if we haven't addressed your question, please do put them in the Q&A and hopefully we can clarify. But the metrics and targets pillar is used to assess and manage relevant climate-related risks and opportunities where information is material. And that's really critical here, because I think one of the common mistakes that we see is organizations set targets, but those are not always connected to the risks and opportunities that are being identified. And so, in particular, for investors, important information to understand is the connection between your company's strategy and its business model, and the metrics and targets that are being considered, and the long-term performance trends of your organizations, and what actions that your company is taking, and how is it sort of demonstrating progress. It wants to see that sort of progress against those targets year on year. And so we have, under this pillar, 2 metrics recommended disclosures and 1 target recommended disclosure. So this first metrics one are the metrics used to assess climate-related risks and opportunities in line with your strategy and risk management process. So here it's important to consider reporting on what performance metrics you have put in place to assess and manage climate-related risks that you have identified for your business. So for example, if you've identified opportunities to grow your products and services from low carbon services and technologies, it's important to think about how you're going to report those revenues and the capital investing that you're making to realize those opportunities. An additional thing to consider understanding, doing, and reporting on here is internal carbon pricing. So internal carbon pricing can be a really valuable way to sort of assess and manage the potential impacts of future climate regulation, particularly carbon taxation. And if you have any questions on this, CDP has put out a number of different reports on how companies are approaching internal carbon pricing and sort of guidance on best practices and the sort of key things that you need to understand around internal carbon pricing. On this next slide, we'll see, taken from the TCFD guidance itself, the sort of 7 key metrics really aimed at enhancing comparability between disclosures. So here you'll see that important metrics to disclose are greenhouse gas emissions, transition risks, physical risks, climate-related opportunities, capital deployment, internal carbon prices, and remuneration. So these are all key things to report on. And again, not just reporting on them on their own, but then really connecting it to the other elements of the TCFD, particularly your strategy. Perfect. That brings us to the second recommended disclosure under the TCFD, which really hones in on those greenhouse gas emissions. So the recommended disclosure is to disclose Scope 1, Scope 2, and if appropriate, Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions and the related risks. And so just to clarify, those Scope 3 or Scope 1 emissions, Scope 1 emissions are emissions that come from the sort of assets that you directly own or control. Scope 2 emissions are, you still have some control over it, but they're a bit more indirect. They're pretty much typically the sort of energy purchases that you make to sort of enable all of the operations in your Scope 1 and 3. And then Scope 3 is your sort of value chain. So both upstream and downstream in your value chain. So everything from your suppliers to your consumers and the emissions that result from those and the related risks. And so with this, the recommended approach is to use a greenhouse gas protocol. That's a sort of carbon accounting methodology that the TCFD recommends using. And then with this, it's important to describe the value chain emissions, those Scope 3 emissions, which are relevant for the emissions to be understood and sort of calculated, and how these are being approached, particularly in terms of the methodology being used. And then again, reporting on any sort of methodologies used, estimation techniques, and data gaps, as there are often data gaps, especially if you're just getting started in this. So it's important not to sort of hide any of those sort of estimation techniques used or any data gaps that exist, but disclose them, and then ideally explain how you're going to fill those data gaps going forward. Perfect. That brings us to the next slide here, which is the final recommended disclosure under this metrics and targets pillar, which is to describe the targets that are being used by your organization to manage climate-related risks and opportunities and your performance against those targets. So how has your company established and communicated climate-related performance targets? Does your organization's targets align with any sort of anticipated regulatory requirements, certain market constraints that might exist, or any other goals that you might be considering? And then do your disclosures really specify whether the targets are absolute emissions or intensity based? So just to clarify, absolute emissions are those sort of gross overall emissions that any entity emits through those Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions, whereas intensity-based emissions are emissions relative to some level of economic output, for example, revenue, and this particularly focuses on understanding efficiency. You then want to sort of explain the timeframes in which they apply and the base year from which progress is being measured. And just to give you a bit more clarity on targets, we've taken again from the TCFD guidance the sort of main characteristics of effective disclosure of climate targets. And here we see that it's important that they are aligned with those strategy and risk management goals that you've set out, that they're linked to relevant metrics, that they're quantified and measurable, that they're clearly specified over time, considering baseline, time horizon, and interim targets, that they're understandable and contextualized, that they're periodically reviewed and updated, and that they're reported annually. To give you a couple examples of what this might look like, here we have an example from British Land on the next slide here. We've seen that they've identified climate-related risks and target opportunities, and then they clearly outline some of the associated metrics that they have to understand these risks and opportunities and how they're managing them. This really demonstrates that they are connecting the metrics that they're reporting against to addressing the material risks that they have faced and have identified for their business. Another case study that we have, mostly here looking at climate metrics, comes from Adani Ports. Here they provide data about their Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. On the left-hand side, there's a graph that reports emissions over time with several years of data to show trends over time. They provide information on emissions intensity, which, as I mentioned, allows us to understand how the business is performing in terms of efficiency against its revenue growth over time. And then on the right-hand side of the slide, they include a breakdown of those Scope 3, those value chain emissions, upstream and downstream, to show where the different aspects of their value chain have a significant impact over their business emissions and where these risks might exist. And to demonstrate, to build on this, since this is just metrics, they could demonstrate a target, for example, by setting targets for their Scope 1 and 2, or even certain parts of their Scope 3 emissions and how they're going to manage those emissions to manage and mitigate those risks over time. That's how they could really look to sort of improve on what they're disclosing here. Hopefully that's clear. Hopefully I've clarified not just the metrics and targets pillar there, but all 4 pillars of the TCFD, and those case studies are really useful to go back to. And when we share these slides, you'll have access to those, and you can use those to learn from them. But in addition to this, just like to sort of re-show you these characteristics of good practice. So this is just a really valuable sort of checklist to reference as you go about your TCFD reporting and to keep in mind throughout this process. So I just wanted to re-share that with you. But before we go on break, I have another poll that should be coming up for you. The question is, which of the following are characteristics of effective climate disclosure? Please select all that apply. So firstly, that they're specific to the reporting entity. Secondly, that they're presented in a separate climate risk report. Thirdly, that they're prepared according to the same rigor as financial information. And lastly, that they're future oriented. I'll just give everyone a moment to fill that out. Before we go on break, Tiffany, are there any other questions that we should address for everyone?
There's been quite a few good questions, Evan. None of them in particular I think we necessarily need to discuss, but I will just remind everyone that we appreciate you asking the questions in the Q&A box so we don't lose track of them. And those who aren't aware of the Q&A box, any of the questions that have been asked and answered there will show up. So you will be able to see other people's questions as they're answered as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Tiffany. And we will try to leave some time at the end if people want to raise a question then as well. Perfect. Seeing a lot of you answer, and it's looking great. There are a few correct answers here. So for those of you that selected specific to the reporting entity, this is indeed correct. For those of you, vast majority of you that selected prepared according to the same rigor as financial information, that is also correct. Just half of you selected that it's future oriented. That is indeed correct, and it's an important one to emphasize, as that's one of the core things that the TCFD is trying to accomplish, is to take a sort of forward-looking approach, helping markets take a forward-looking approach to climate change. And so that is indeed true, if that was unclear. A couple of you did select that it presented in a separate climate risk report. We do understand that this is sometimes needed, and sometimes you need a report in itself to reference to your mainstream financial filing. But given, again, that this is sort of, we're focusing here particularly on financially material information relevant to climate, it should not just be presented in a separate climate risk report and really be integrated into your annual reporting. And so hopefully that's clear. Happy to pick up any questions on that if you want further explanation. But with that, we can go on a 5-minute break. So please come back in 5 minutes, everyone.
Okay, we have 1 hour left together. So I hope that you found the first hour useful. And now we'd like to help you understand how to move forward on the implementation in aligning your TCFD or your disclosure with TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So to get started, hopefully everybody had a little bit of a maybe walk around, a stretch, a coffee, and they're ready to start thinking about how this works in your own companies. We wanted to discuss some of the key challenges that are facing all of you as you move forward on this journey. And we're happy to hear your thoughts in the chat box as well as we move forward. So here is kind of the key common challenges that we often see companies are facing. First is about that governance pillar. So how do you get leadership buy-in? So we'll discuss that together. Also, we've said many times now how important it is to integrate this information into your annual report. So we'll go over again how you can get started on that. Just as a reminder, I've noted this in the chat box as well. The TCFD does indeed recommend that all companies include any material information in their annual report. So that is anything that has a financial impact. Now, as a reminder, the TCFD has been developed to help identify those financial impacts. So really starting to understand how climate does have material and a financial impact on your organizations. And the TCFD does consider both the governance pillar that Evan just went through, those 2 governance recommended disclosures, and the risk management pillar, which had 3 recommended disclosures to be material for all organizations. So you can already keep that in mind, that governance and risk management are 2 pillars that can be considered material for all organizations, so should be in your annual report. The TCFD also did discuss GHG emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, as being material to all organizations as well. So at least our scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions should be included in our annual report. So we'll discuss how to do that, how to pull that information into our annual report. And then, okay, where to get started as you're moving along this journey. Where do you start with? How do you move forward? We discussed a 3-phased approach last time, so we're going to give you another option today. And then, of course, how does this fit with other reporting standards and frameworks? We introduced that last time as well, so we want to look further into what role these other frameworks are playing. Now, someone's been asking about TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. So while we don't go deep into that, we discussed it a bit last time. Just keeping in mind that all these frameworks are working in coordination, so they all work very well together. And then finally, we're going to discuss why should we disclose information if our peers are not. This question's becoming increasingly less relevant as more and more companies are disclosing this information. But it's important to note that specifically in the SME sector and smaller companies, and also in less developed companies, we are seeing that companies are still struggling to get moving on this. So of course, we want to discuss why you should get moving on these topics. Okay, so let's get started with that first question. How do I get leadership buy-in? Now, if you are asking this question already, as we discussed in the 101, you are asking the right question, that's for sure. What we like to highlight is kind of 3 key stakeholders that you want to really make clear their position when you discuss this with your board and your leadership. Now, the first key stakeholder to take into consideration is, of course, investors. Now, as a reminder, the TCFD was developed by the financial community, and it was investors coming together saying, we don't have the right information in order to assess and to price these climate-related risks and opportunities. So we need more information from companies in order to make these decisions, these financial decisions. So a really good starting point is really to make that kind of positioning of investors clear. There's lots of information on that. You can illustrate how important this is becoming to investors. But one of the areas you might want to start with is looking at, are your key investors already supporters of the TCFD? And you can do that by going to the TCFD supporters page. That's just on the FSB TCFD website. And now if your investors are not maybe key supporters, or maybe they're not an official supporter of the TCFD, start a conversation with them. Have that conversation. Ask them what climate-related information they're looking at and how they're assessing it, and how you can provide it in a way that's most useful to them. Now, in addition to investors, which are really demanding this information, we're also seeing a regulatory movement. So Evan really talked about this in our session, the 101 session on Tuesday, and how we're really seeing a wave of regulatory requirements from companies. So whether you operate in a supply chain that exists in a country where it is mandatory, where that company is now going to require you to provide, for example, your scope 1 and 2 emissions, which your scope 1 emissions will be counted for their scope 3 emissions. So we're all kind of connected in these supply chains in disclosure. But also as larger developed nations are pushing this through and requiring it, then of course, not only their procurement and their supply chain need to step it up, their disclosures, but also other governments are aligning their requirements with these mandatory requirements. Also remembering, as we discussed last time, the IFRS Foundation, which is our financial accounting standards, has now created the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board. And with that, we're getting now kind of global standardized guidance on sustainability and climate-related disclosures. And now when those come out in a bit this year, we expect them in June or July, we will then expect more and more governments making this mandatory. So it's important to start getting ready for this, and it's important to make that clear to your board and your leadership that it's not something that you'll be able to do kind of overnight. Remember, the TCFD takes 3 to 5 years to implement. So starting to collect this information now is really important if you haven't done so already. Then the third kind of key stakeholder to keep in mind as you're presenting this to your board or your leadership is your peers. What other companies in your sector, in your industry, in your region, what are they doing? Now, the reason I think this is so important is because as investors are making these financial decisions, they need to take whatever information is available out there to make those decisions. So as your peers provide more and more information, it actually provides more information to investors about you. Investors get a better idea about what risks and opportunities are facing your particular industry or your sector, and then they make decisions based on how you're managing those risks and opportunities. So if you're staying silent, then you show investors that maybe you're a bit riskier because you're not addressing these risks and opportunities. So once you have those kind of key ideas in place, you've highlighted those 3 key stakeholders. The next step is really starting kind of the education and the training, providing that additional information to your board through seminars like this or other educational portals to help highlight what are those strategic and financial implications. Now, really, that's key there is making that connection between climate and finance, because that's where it becomes relevant to boards and leadership. And if we're going to make that connection between finance and climate, don't just focus on the risk. Make sure that those opportunities are clear too, because that's what boards and leadership like to jump towards. They don't like to be in risk management mode all the time, of course. So all companies like to be growing and expanding. So important to really identify what are those opportunities that are available to companies. And just as a reminder, the TCFD does highlight key opportunities to look for. So that's resource efficiency, energy source, products and services, markets, and resilience. So looking at how those might be important opportunities for your company. Now, the second key question that we wanted to review today is how to pull this information into your mainstream report. Now, as I just mentioned at the beginning of this session, the TCFD does suggest that all material information get pulled into your annual report. Now, some of the confusion that comes with that statement is that a lot of times when we think of our annual report, our financial statements, we think completely quantitatively. We think of, the balance sheet and just the financial information and all numbers. But it's important to remember that when any company reports on their financial statements, particularly public companies, that financial statement comes with explanatory information as well. So we provide kind of a reporting package to investors. And in that reporting package, we should be providing any material information anyway. So beyond climate, if your company foresees any significant risks or opportunities that might impact that trajectory that we're seeing in our financial statements, those trends that we're seeing, that should be included in that reporting package. We also use it to explain why maybe things we expected to happen didn't happen. So this TCFD is just helping us to integrate the climate aspect in that. Just the key point here is that a separate TCFD report, a separate climate report, was not the intention of the TCFD. Even though a lot of companies are using that as the starting point, that can't be the end goal. The end goal, if you're going to align with the TCFD, is to make sure that you're including this information in that annual reporting package, using it as an explanatory note together with your financial information. So how you integrate that is making sure that all the different authors of your annual report, whether that be one, whether that be 5 or 20, depending on how many people work on your annual report, making sure that all of them understand how the risks and opportunities of climate may impact the different sections of the report, and then embedding it where it makes most sense in the report. So you'll already have in an annual report a section that discusses the corporate governance, the board of your company, how the board interacts with the management, how the board makes decisions. So TCFD helps you integrate climate into that, understanding where climate lies on the agenda. Do you have a certain climate expert, a committee that works on this, etc.? Making sure that that information is pulled in where it makes most sense. So ensuring that all the authors of the annual report are understanding the climate related risks and opportunities. Also, since, as I said, it's pulling it into where it makes most sense in that report, that means that all companies will put it in a slightly different place. No two annual reports look the same. So it can sometimes be helpful to have a TCFD mapping or cross-referencing table so that it's easier to find this information for investors looking specifically for climate-related information. However, it's also a great tool for you as a reporting company as you're developing these reports to see if there's any gaps in your reporting. So we'll see examples of a TCFD cross-referencing table momentarily, but that helps us to understand maybe what information might be missing. Highly recommended, we'll discuss this more momentarily as well, to start with any existing content or sustainability disclosures. Someone was asking in the chat, really good question, about ESG versus the TCFD. Now, a lot of companies already create a sustainability report or an ESG report, which is looking at that environmental, social, and governance perspective. Now, if you already do that, the first step is really pulling that information into your annual report if it's deemed as having a material or financial impact on your organization. Now, the key point at the end here is to ensure that all of that information that has that financial impact, those risks, those opportunities that might impact your company's bottom line in the short, medium, or long term should be in your annual report. Anything that doesn't have that financial impact, it can go in your sustainability report, in your climate change report, in a separate report. That's fine. An example I often give here is that a number of companies will be doing something like a tree planting or maybe a beach cleanup with their employees, which is really seen as kind of a philanthropic activity, as well as motivating staff, giving them the opportunity to work on these key activities that are helping the planet. Now, that likely won't have an impact, a significant impact on your company's bottom line. You probably won't be spending so much money on tree planting that it's going to impact your bottom line. So that can go in your sustainability report. However, if you are contributing to, for example, growing new forests as an offsetting activity to your emissions, then that should appear in your annual report, because that's a risk mitigation that you're doing, because you've identified as a company that higher emissions is indeed a risk to your company. So just keeping it in mind that way, whether it has a financial impact or not on your organization. Okay, so I did mention that we have a cool tool that you can use, which is a cross-referencing table or mapping, and they're very simple to do. As you can see with this company, which is quite advanced in their climate-related disclosures, that they just have the themes, so those 4 core pillars on the furthest left column, so governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets, and they've given the description straight at a TCFD there. Then they list the 11 recommended disclosures, so 2 for governance, and then there's 3 for each for strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. Those are the recommended disclosures that Evan just went through with all of you. Then on the furthest right column, they identify where can you find this information in their report. Now, as you'll see, they have more than one report where you can find this information. They list the URD, which is the Universal Registration Document. That's their annual report. And as you'll notice on this particular company, they have included in their URD or their annual report all 11 recommended disclosures. So as I say, they're quite advanced. And then in addition to what they've included in their URD, they've provided more context or that information that's deemed less material in other reports. So they might have included information in their CDP questionnaire, or they also have a climate change report. So that shows investors where they can find all the information that the TCFD recommends. And we highly recommend using this also as a gap analysis tool to see if you're missing something in your reporting. I also like to share these 2 guidance documents when we're talking about financial impact, since that's so important to pulling information into our annual report, assessing that financial impact. Highly recommend making use of the TCFD's metrics, targets, and transition plans guidance from 2021. It's a hyperlink in the slide, so when you get the slides at the end of the session, you can make use of that. Also in their 2021 implementation guide that came along with the updated recommended disclosures, you can find more detailed understanding of what that financial impact might be. So there's just a quick summary on your slide, kind of understanding if these risks and opportunities will then impact, increased revenue from new products or services, increased costs due to carbon price, business interruption, contingency, repairs, etc. So helping you go through all of these possible financial impacts as a company and determining whether that will be realized in your organization. Now, the next question is what to start with. So, I guess we've already hinted at the fact that you should start with that information you already have and that information that is deemed to be financially material. But this kind of 4-level pathway is another very useful pathway as you get started on implementing the TCFD's recommendations. Now, what I like to highlight with this particular pathway is that it starts at level 0. So level 0 does not necessarily mean that your company is not doing anything or not recognizing the importance of climate change, but they're not communicating it. So it's really important to look at your annual report and see, is there any awareness communicated about climate-related risks and opportunities? And if not, then you're at level 0. And the first step is really to start that communication channel. So having your CEO or chair of the board write in their, annual letter in that report, some reference to climate change and action being taken in the company. Also, that often comes along with setting some sort of policy at your organization's level on acting on these risks and opportunities related to climate. Now, once it's been acknowledged, then you start building up that capacity, which it's possible you already have built up. Maybe you just haven't communicated it. So that often comes with measuring your scope 1 and 2 GHG emissions. Now, as a reminder, those scope 1 emissions are the emissions that you really own. So they're the emissions specific to your organization. And the scope 2 emissions are emissions that you really electricity you buy. So heating or electricity that you buy are included in scope 2. So scope 1 and 2 are the emissions you fully control or buy that are relevant for your specific operations. Then scope 3 emissions is going into your value chain. So any, looking at a product before it arrives to you, everything you procure, what are the emissions related to all of the supply of the materials you need, but then also moving on to the client, how is that product being used and what are the resultant emissions of that? So scope 1 or 2 is where you start to build that capacity, which then you can work on scope 3 later on once you've built that initial capacity. So with that initial capacity and really understanding those emissions and what risks might be related to them, we move into integrating into your operational decision making. And so pulling in there really the understanding of what are these risks and opportunities, starting to implement that climate change policy, starting to work on scope 3 emissions, and making a more operational decision makings. So changing maybe what suppliers you're using, making more kind of concrete decisions on how your operations work. And then the final step 4, is really building that into your strategy as an organization, really looking long-term, understanding these shifts that are happening, doing a scenario analysis, as Evan mentioned, and understanding how you might need to make shifts in your strategy as an organization and really high-level decisions that will ensure your resilience really in the long term. So as a reminder, we also shared that 3-phased approach last time. Both of these are very much aligned and they can just help you move forward. But the key is really building those core foundational levels first, building that capacity, and then moving forward to really get a strategic output. Okay, and then second to last question is, how does this fit with other reporting standards and frameworks? So somebody was already asking about TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures. We also have a number of other frameworks. Some of you might be using the CDP questionnaire. You might be using a CDSB guidance. You might be reporting using GRI for a sustainability report, or using the IRC to integrate into your reporting non-financial information, or a more kind of industry focused approach like SASB, which tends to be the norm in the US. So any of these frameworks have helped you to get started on this. So the good news is if you recognize any of these acronyms, if you're using any of these frameworks, you're already started. So that's really great. And all of them have been mapped to the TCFD. So you can even use already existing mapping to understand kind of which of the disclosures you're already providing will help you with your TCFD. And the next step is really then that materiality assessment, pulling into your annual report any of that information that's deemed to be material. So with that, the one thing to highlight here really is that the IFRS, in developing the ISSB, has started its sustainability disclosures through 2 areas. First, the general sustainability guidance, but then second, the climate guidance. So as we mentioned in June or July, ISSB will be releasing a standard for climate related disclosures, which builds directly off of the TCFD. So they use the same core pillars, same as TNFD as well, looking at governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets, and then just different perspectives of it. So if you're hesitant to start on TCFD because ISSB is already moving, don't be. The ISSB considers TCFD a foundation to build off of. So do get started on TCFD because that will help you as ISSB comes forward and as more regulation moves forward. Please make use as you're moving forward with kind of pulling in information from other reports of the TCFD Knowledge Hub, because that's a really great resource that you can use with a number of different mappings and examples to see how people have built off of these existing disclosure guidelines to enhance their TCFD disclosure. Now, the final question, why should we disclose information if our peers are not? Now, as I said, less and less we're seeing this question because more and more companies are already disclosing in alignment with TCFD. But I think it's still really important to address, and that's specifically, as I mentioned at the beginning, because as your peers provide information, that means investors know more and more about the risks and opportunities facing you. So key to understand here is that investors do indeed need this information for their capital allocation decisions. We do get people say quite often, no, our investors, they don't care about this, or no, we've talked to investors and they're not considering it. They are, but they might not be referring to it as climate specifically. So it's important to realize that these risks are real. They're climate related physical risks and transition risks. So investors are always looking at market trends. Investors are always looking at how assets might face higher insurance premiums, for example. They might be looking at how customers are looking into totally different industries, or how costly a company is going to be. If energy costs spike significantly, what impact does that have on your company? And these are things that investors are always looking at. So keeping that in mind, that investors are always looking at this information, the absence of such disclosures as the TCFD, the absence of sharing with investors your mitigation plan, your adaptation plan, how you plan to deal with these risks and capitalize on these opportunities, does not imply to investors an absence of risk. It actually implies the absence of risk management. So that makes you seem like a more risky company because you're not dealing with these risks and opportunities. Or you're not capitalizing on the opportunities. So if you're not sharing with investors, if you're a highly energy intensive company and you're not sharing with investors your plan if energy prices get excessive, if carbon taxes are put in place, if the reputational risk of being a high energy company that does cause a lot of polluting in the planet, the impact of your supply chain deciding not to work with you anymore, or clients deciding not to buy your products anymore. It's important to have that conversation publicly to be clear that you are aware of these risks and that you are starting to work on them. So providing up-to-date information is important because constantly this is changing. We're constantly improving our risk mitigation strategies. The opportunities keep coming at us. So it's important to keep this up to date in order to accurately reflect your organization's kind of internal structures and internal risk management processes. Now, we're not saying you have to give away your company secrets. We're just saying that you need to share with investors that you are kind of on top of this, that you're making sure that you're keeping your eyes open for these risks and opportunities. And the final point on this slide is really that mandatory reporting is coming, and it does take a while to be prepared for this. So one example is on those metrics and targets, we like to see historical data. So for example, if we want to see the last 3 or 4 years of your scope 3 emissions, that means you have to have already started calculating that in order to have that historical data. So highly recommend getting started on that soon so that you can build up that capacity and make sure that investors understand what it is that you're doing to mitigate these risks. So just get started. That's the key, I think, statement here is don't let perfection get in the way. None of us are 100% ready for the risks and opportunities that climate that we're facing from these risks and opportunities. So as Evan was mentioning with the scenario analysis, start small, work your way up. You learn as you go. The science improves. You can adapt as you enhance that analysis, but just get started to make sure that you're not too late on acting on any of these risks and opportunities, because a lot of the mitigation or the adjustments that a company needs to make need to take time to put into place. So don't wait till it's too late. And with that, just to make sure everybody is still with me, thanks for the thumbs up. I'm glad somebody's going to get started. One more question for you, and then we'll do an exercise. So which of the following would be ways to integrate climate disclosure in a mainstream report? Now, these aren't all correct, so think through them. based on what we were discussing about integrating this into your annual report or your mainstream report, would you consider using a cross-referencing table to map content? Would you maybe add just a small box on TCFD in your report, but keep the main details on your website? Would you engage with authors of the different report sections to make sure that it's embedded throughout the report? Or would you publish the information in a sustainability report for now? And I'll give you just a moment to fill that in. Evan, while we wait for this, were there any questions in the Q&A that you wanted to discuss?
Nope. I think you've covered it all. Hopefully everything's been clear.
Okay. Valentine just asked, would I need to have the TCFD report assured? You don't need to. Keeping in mind that a TCFD report is really non-existent. So a TCFD recommends putting this information in your annual report, and often annual reports are assured or verified. So all the main accounting firms that would do that do know how to verify this information as well. Also to note that, of course, when they're verifying this information, they're not verifying that you're not providing false information. They're verifying that the information is there. So it's important to be careful and consider that reputational risk. If you're promising too much to the market, can you actually achieve that? That's up to you as an organization to decide and make sure that you're providing accurate information in your report. Okay, so your answers here, I'm going to end the poll and discuss them with you. So the majority of you, nearly 70%, said to use a cross-referencing table to map content. Hurrah, yes, I think that's a really great answer. And it's not only helpful to investors, but it's also helpful to the report preparer to do kind of a gap analysis of that. The next most popular answer was 67% was to engage with authors of the different report sections. 100%, yes, you should all be doing that. I think it's really important that anyone whose pen touches that report should understand what are these climate-related risks and opportunities and how they might impact each of the different areas of the report that they're working on. The other two, so 50% of you, about half, well, exactly half of you that filled this in said to publish the information as sustainability report for now. Now, you can start that way, but please don't consider that the last step. The important thing is that this information is getting pulled into your annual report. And remember that the TCFD considers governance and risk management to be material for all organizations. And so already, if you have that information, don't even bother starting with a sustainability report. Pull that into your annual report. It's material. It's important to your organization to have the right governance structures and the right risk management structures. So discuss even at the most minimal level how climate is discussed, even if it's on an ad hoc basis, even if you're, looking at maybe developing a committee, or if you have plans, start having that discussion, start thinking about it as an organization, how you make sure that climate is integrated into those processes and policies. And then the fewest of you answered, 28%, said to add a small box on TCFD, but keep the details on your website. And I agree, that's also not the best way forward. So you can start, maybe you're going from level 0 to 1, as we were discussing in that TPI framework, and you're just acknowledging it and recognizing that you're getting started on that. So that might be either in a small box or in a comment from your CEO or your chair in their letter to investors. But if you have enough information to put on your website, I recommend already trying to pull that into your annual report. Investors will not necessarily find it on your website. So it's making it accessible and usable by investors by pulling it into that annual report package. Okay, so with that, let's do a quick exercise. We have a good amount of time. We have half an hour left. So let's take some time to look at 3 different reports. Now, you might not have time to look at all 3, but just a reminder, I'm not asking you to read the whole report. So keep an eye on the page number here. So we have 3 reports that Vanina is just sharing with you in the chat box. So the first example is on governance. So just as a reminder to everyone that with governance, we want to see certain aspects. We want to see the management's oversight and the board's oversight, if you remember that from when we were discussing it just now with Evan. So when you're looking at that report on page 17, look for those two core recommendations, the board oversight and what the management's role is, and determine what you think is particularly good. Did they provide that information? Is it clear? And what information is missing? Maybe they didn't provide all the information that was recommended by the TCFD. So what could be added? And then have a think about how you might adopt something they're doing in their report in your own reporting process. So that's example 1 is on governance. The example 2 is looking at strategy. So specifically pages 9 to 15 of this TCFD report from Vodafone. So what elements are particularly good in that? And remember, from strategy, we wanted to understand first, what are the material risks and opportunities facing an organization? Second, what is that impact? And third, how resilient is a company's strategy? So are they using a scenario analysis to identify kind of in the future how resilient their strategy will be? And then the third one, metrics and targets with Sunway Sustainability Report from 2020. Look at page 16 in particular, where they're looking at metrics and targets there. And again, what's good about that and risk in metrics and targets, we want to understand what metrics are they using and are they aligned with their strategy component and the risk management? So are they the same risks and opportunities identified as being material? And then the targets also associated with those metrics. So we want historical data. We also want to know where you're moving in the future. And then their GHG emissions as well, ideally scope 1 and scope 2 and scope 3, but for sure scope 1 and 2 we want to see. So we'll give you 10 minutes to look at that. It's 6 past the hour now. So if we come at 16 past the hour, we'll then discuss each of these examples together. Thanks, everyone. Okay, just 1 minute left. So anyone who's already typing, maybe send that to us now. Your thoughts on what's particularly good, what could be further improved, and what you might adopt in your own reporting. And we'll start discussing those 3 reports in just 1 minute. Okay, so we haven't had many responses, so I hope you've had time to look at the report. If not, you can follow along as we go and maybe take some time to look at the reports afterwards and have a think about how you might answer these questions. So let's get started on the first example, which was looking at governance. So as you'll see here, there were a few kind of good practices that we saw. Someone just also shared in the chat that there's the good thing that they saw was the establishment of the Chief Sustainability Officer position, indeed, and the reference to how reporting is done between the board and the CSO position. Yes, that's very important for us to understand. Not only is there, a climate specialist, a sustainability specialist, but how are they communicating with the rest of the team? That's really great. And then the other 2 people that commented on that, they also noted the frequency of meeting. Ellie, yeah, good point. It's really important for us to understand not only how they're talking, but how often. And then Austin mentioned the existence of a sustainability committee in the board and cross integration with different departments in the organization. Yes, that's also really important. So we're getting a bit of a picture of how sustainability is addressed within this organization. So we also said they provided really important information on the roles of relevant individual committees or functions. They give a good description of what are the function of those particular committees. We also have this visual diagram, which you can see on the screen now, which illustrates the organizational structure. That we see that a lot. I think that can be very helpful to understand kind of where sustainability, or as we're looking for here, climate specifically fits, and timing, understanding kind of how often they're discussing. So a quarterly sustainability report. A few things missing here. We noted a detail of responsibility and feedback mechanisms. And what we want to know here actually on those feedback mechanisms is specifically on climate. We want to understand how climate fits in here. So let's look at a couple examples that can help understand that a little bit more. So here, this is Aberdeen's 2021 report, and you can see that the specific oversight provided by the board is clarified. The delegation of responsibilities to board committees and management functions is also outlined in a simple organogram. As you'll see in the kind of points below, we also understand how they address certain climate-related issues. So for example, if you look next to the box that says Chief Executive Officer, they indicate here as climate change sponsor in the organization. Their CEO is responsible for overseeing climate-related risks and opportunities and delegates managers to execute, or to their executive leadership team members in order to execute those plans. So it can be something quite simple like that, just integrating that specific information there. But we want to understand in their governance structure, where does climate sit? We have here another example. So this is from Nedbank, and you'll see they've made climate really quite clear. They have a climate task team, but they don't just leave it there. They don't just say they have a climate task team. They also make sure that it's understood kind of where that sits in their board oversight and what are the functions. So here in their board oversight blurb, they say that the board's role is to monitor, approve, provide oversight, and review the defined climate-related risks and opportunities, translating into governance strategy, risk management, as well as metrics and targets. So we really understand kind of there, what is the board's role in overseeing this? Also, there's a climate risk function. So in 2020, a new business unit called the Climate Risk and Resilience Unit was established at Nedbank. This sits within the group strategic risk division. And they were particularly tasked with actively monitoring the climate-related risks and opportunities across the enterprise by providing sound leadership, effective challenge, advice and support, and monitoring oversight. So we now understand kind of a little bit more about how climate sits within this organization. And while not all will be able to maybe develop a climate-related task force or team in the organization, and maybe they don't need to because maybe the climate risks and opportunities facing the organization aren't as high monetary wise as some other organizations. It's important to understand who is making sure and how are you making sure that these risks and opportunities are being evaluated. Okay, so with the next one, then let's look at Vodafone. I'm not sure if anyone had the chance to look at the Vodafone document. Vodafone's strategy component here is on page 9 to 15. And just to note that this is their TCFD report, which is not necessarily what we recommended, but it does provide a good, useful area to look so that we can evaluate their disclosures. So some good practices that we saw here is that they do identify those material climate-related risks and opportunities. And they indeed reflect the resilience of the organization's strategy using a scenario analysis. Now, of course, all reports can be improved on. So one improvement we see here is to provide more narratives of how strategy has addressed climate risks and how these risks and opportunities inform financial planning processes. And it'd be good to know more about the financial impact. So remember, in the strategy component, we wanted to understand what are the risks and opportunities that the organization has deemed to be financially material. But also, we want to understand what is that financial impact. When you say financially material, investors want to know what you mean by that. So how is it going to impact your company financially? And as a reminder, there were tools we gave earlier. So in these slides, you'll have references to those documents from TCFD to help to understand that financial impact. And then the third pillar of strategy was the scenario analysis. So that's that resilience, understanding how resilient a company's strategy will be moving forward. And a couple additional examples here to understand how to kind of link that strategy with those risks and opportunities. So in this one, CDL provides a real concise description of the strategic mitigation or adaptation being undertaken in order to respond to the risk or identify that it has been identified as being financially material. They also indicate what region and business unit the risk applies to, and therefore where in the organization this strategy applies. So you can see here the column on the left is the specific risks, and they are aligned with the risk categories that the TCFD recommends using. Then their strategies in terms of, now this isn't their overall business strategy. This is their strategies for adapting to or mitigating these risks or opportunities. And then they let us know where that's applicable. Another example you can look at here is Hitachi. I'm going to skip through this one because we're short on time, but you can look at this on your own time. And another one that I really like here is Meridian. They in this table really condense a lot of information, but they help understand kind of what are these risks. So in the first column there, they discuss physical risks from extreme rainfall, and this is a hydro company, so they do have hydro dams. So if there's too much rainfall, then of course the dams get full, and then they have to obviously open them to let the water go through, and they lose the revenue from that because they won't be able to collect all the money from that rainfall. So they look at this as a physical risk from increased rainfall. The scale they note as being medium, and they note the likelihood as so-so. And then the time frame as long-term, and note that they don't just say long-term, they also give the year. So for them, long-term is 30 years or more. So then they discuss what is that financial impact. So they tell you The impact is increased intensity of extreme rainfall events in high catchments, which financially impacts them in around about, they could see in about 30-year time frame, about an $11 million impact. What's important here is they also identify how they determined that. So that's key there, to identify the how aspect too. Okay, and then finally, I'm just noting we only have 5 minutes left, so I guess I've been chatting a bit too much. So the last slide here is on looking at Sunway's metrics and targets. One person did say that what they thought was good was that they were disclosing how the identified metrics and targets align with the SDGs. So great, yeah, we're all trying to contribute to those sustainable development goals now. So it's really good to see that a company is working towards that as well. We thought the same. They clearly linked those targets to particular goals, and they clearly demonstrated the performance against targets for the financial year. However, what we'd really like to see is those targets linked to climate-related risks and opportunities. So remember, in your metrics and targets, we want to see alignment from the metrics you choose and those high risks and high opportunities. So if you've gone through that effort of identifying what risks and opportunities are going to impact you, you should be measuring those, because how are you going to mitigate that? How are you going to know you're doing well on it? How do you know you're going to be able to achieve these opportunities if you're not measuring them and setting targets on them? So just an example here, we already looked at British Land earlier. I think we saw this exact same example even, but just to show how you can outline that. So British Land puts out those risk categories and opportunity categories that TCFD highlights. These were the ones that are financially material to them. So policy and legal risks, extreme weather risks, and resource supply risks, and then resource efficiency opportunities, energy source opportunities, and products and services. So then they set specific metrics and targets that align specifically with those risks and opportunities. So with that, we're going to move on, and I believe I passed it back to you, Evan, right, to take us through the end of this.
Absolutely.
Good luck in 3 minutes.
Very quick with these resources. You'll have the slides so you can revisit all of these, but we've got a few resources here from CDSB and CDP, sort of just building on some of the guidance that we provided today. Again, we have the model guidance from the UNSSC, which should really be your go-to guide as you go through this process. We also have these recordings. I think one of you asked you on the UNSSC website if you'd like to go back and look at a generic recording. And then here we have the TCFD Knowledge Hub. So here you can see the link, and it's a database. You can search specific companies, types of report, year published, specific industries, specific geographies to find the resources that can really best support you. And so it's a really great database for you to use in this work. I'd like to also really highlight the incredible resources from our partners in this training, the IFC, particularly their Beyond the Balance Sheet Toolkit, a really great ecosystem of resources. So please go check out the IFC website there for all of those resources. There's also the TCFD 102E program. These in-person trainings are sadly coming to an end, but you can continue the training if you'd like to. Those TCFD 102E trainings are on the TCFD Knowledge Hub, and they're adding a number of different courses over time, touching on a range of different topics that you can see here on the slide. That was a very quick overview of the resources, but they're all in the slide, they're all there. So please use them to support your work. With that, I'll pass it back to Tiffany.
Thanks, Evan. Sorry for leaving you with 2 minutes, but well done. Everyone, yes, you can access those in the slides, which are in the chat box now. Okay, to get your certificate before we go today, we just require that you fill in a feedback survey. So you have in the chat box now a link to the feedback survey. It's a Google form. So if your company does block the Google Drive, you might have to do it on your telephone, or if you have a smartphone, or from home perhaps. But we do require you to fill in that survey in order to get your certificate. And you do have to fill that in, not by March 9th in the past, but 7 days from today. So that'll be early April sometime. 7 days from now is your deadline. So please fill it in as soon as possible. Easiest if you just do it today. Before we go, thank you to all of our partners. If you need to contact any of us, please feel free to with any questions you might have. And thank you to the Nairobi Securities Exchange for hosting us today, and of course to Bloomberg Philanthropies and IFC for making the financial support available for us to provide this training for free. And also thank you, Evan. Thank you, Vanina. This is actually our last TCFD training session together. So it was a pleasure, and thank you all for joining us. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.